Hi, this is Beth Billings from Around the Table Yarns. Tonight is our second of three for the Dip in the Road Socks by Kate Atherley. Tonight we're going to be working on the heel turn and the reinforced heel flap, and the heel turn, and then picking up the gusset stitches. We probably won't get to all of the decreases for the gusset, but we can talk about them. And that's going to be all of everything that we do tonight. So let's get started. Some notes here I'm going to hopefully be able to share. The Dip in the Road Socks is a paid pattern by Kate Atherley, and so we won't be showing the pattern, but I can show you my sock du jour, my socks so far. We started here with a German twisted cast on or a long tail cast on, and then the socks are mirror images of each other. So I have my other sock here, and you can see that we set up these rows of ribbing to mirror each other. So you can wear your socks this way, or you can wear your socks this way, but either way there's the left foot and the right foot will not match exactly, but they will coordinate. I've already done the reinforced heel flap on one of my socks so that I can demonstrate the heel turn without too much difficulty, but I just want to point out to you that the reinforced heel flap is achieved by stacking slipped stitches on top of each other. And we set that up in the first row with slip stitches that are not in the stack. So there's something a little bit unusual about the way she sets up this first row, and we're going to talk about that in detail, and then how to do this part of it on my sample sock over here. And then I'll show on this one how we actually turn the heel to make the Dutch heel that is called for in the pattern. All right, so I have worked across to the halfway point of my sock. Now I have a set number of stitches on here, and I was reading the pattern, and the pattern is very interesting. And I'm not going to give you the actual numbers because, again, it's a paid pattern and I don't have the permission to do that. But in the setup row for the reinforced heel flap, for each size, she says work across all number of stitches of the instep, and the number that she gives you is one more than the number of stitches on your instep side. So you're going to just essentially that first setup row number one is a right side row, and you work across all of the instep stitches plus one more. If you're doing this on double pointed needles, she would like you to have your instep stitches on one needle. So it would be the next stitch on the next needle, whether you're doing double points or two circulars or magic loop. And you're going to knit that stitch because it would have been knitted. So it's all in pattern. So you would work across all the instep stitches in pattern plus one more, and the one more should be on the next needle, whatever the next needle is. And then after that one, she tells you to knit one, slip one, a set number of times, but the set number comes to, with this extra stitch, comes to one less than the number of stitches you would have had on your heel side. So there's just this little quirk about the pattern, and I emailed her personally and asked, and she confirmed that this is what she intended. So the effect of this is to offset the very first row of slipped stitches from the rest of them. And she intended this because I asked twice. So let's just see how that works. So I have worked across all of my instep stitches, and the plus one is here. It's the first stitch of my foot. So I'm going to work that one, and that would be all of my instep stitches plus 1. And now after that's the semicolon, it says knit 1. So I'm going to knit another 1 and then slip 1, knit 1, slip 1 so many times. And the so many times takes me to the very last stitch on my heel side. So I'm just going to do that. Notice that I am slipping all of these stitches purlwise when I slip them. So at the end of this, slip 1, knit 1, slip 1, there's my last pair. And then I have 1 stitch remaining, and you knit that 1 stitch. So that's set up row 1 complete. Essentially, it means that you start with a knit 2 at the beginning of your heel stitches. And that's the clearest I can come up with for you. And then you end with a knit 1. Is that as clear as mud for everybody? And then we turn back. So this is now setup row number 2. And in setup row number 2, you slip the first stitch purlwise. And then you purl what essentially gets you back to the beginning of your heel stitches. And that's true for each size that's listed. So I'm just going back over to the beginning of the heel stitches, and I'm purling every stitch. Now I just want to point out in the pattern, it's knit 1, slip 1 to the last stitch and knit 1. But the setup row 2, this is sort of the difference between pandas, eat shoots, and leaves. It's really important where the comma is here. This knit 1, slip 1 is in parentheses, and they're repeated across the whole thing. So you knit 1, you slip 1, you knit 1, you slip 1, you knit 1, you slip 1. But when you get to the purl rows, the wrong side rows are slip 1 and then purl the remainder of the stitches. So you don't slip 1, purl 1, slip 1, purl 1. You slip 1 and then purl all the rest of the stitches to the end of the row. And that happens each time there's a purl row in the heel flap and the heel turn. So that's one thing to pay attention to. So I'm working all the way over to the other side of my heel stitches, and I'm only going to be working back and forth on the heel stitches from this point until I'm done with my heel flap. And when I'm done with my heel turn. All right, so we turn back. So you can't really see the slip stitches so clearly, but they're slightly elongated compared to the ones that were knit. Now we're going to do rows 1 and 2. We've done the 2 setup rows, and now we're going to do rows 1 and 2 of the reinforced heel. In row 1, you slip the first stitch and you knit the second stitch. And then you slip the next stitch. So you actually, it does set up, silly me, it does set up the slip stitches. It does not offset them. It's just that you didn't slip the very first stitch at the beginning of this row in the setup row. Look at that. How clever. So now the slip stitches, you can sort of see, look a little more elongated than the stitch next to it. And that's because they were slipped in the previous row. And that's what gives the heel flap and the heel turn the reinforcement that we're looking for on this very heavily worn part of your sock. All right, so there's my slip one, knit one, all the way to the end, and you end with a knit one. Now, when we turn, we're going to slip that first stitch again, purlwise. I didn't slip it in the last row. I knitted it in the last row, but we always start with a slip one at the beginning of the row. And we're just going to purl all the way across. And that's the beginning of the reinforced heel. Those 2 rows are repeated the set number of times for your size of sock. The way that you can count the repeats is either by counting these slip stitch lines in the back or by counting your elongated stitches in the front, whichever works out to be the easiest for you to see. Sometimes I find the ones on the back side easier to read. Get to the end, and then we'll go to the heel turn. The heel turn for this sock is very elegant. I feel like a strong heel and a Dutch heel are the same thing, but I haven't looked it up yet today. And when I said it was a strong heel, somebody corrected me and said it was a Dutch heel. And I'm not sure. So if you know, feel free to put it into the chat. All right, so if you keep going with that, it looks like this. You can turn it over and count the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. That's how many times I was supposed to do it for my size. Now we're going to do the heel turn. And there's a couple things I want you to pay attention to. This is at the bottom of page 3 in your pattern. You're still working back and forth, but we're essentially going to divide these stitches roughly into thirds and work the center third up and decrease on each side. As we go this way, we decrease one, and as we go back this way, we decrease one evenly until all of these stitches have been turned into, and it makes this nice little box. So the first row, row 1, you work in pattern. The pattern that you are working in is the row 1 from before. So it's this row 1 from the reinforced heel flap. So you'll work in pattern, but not across all. You'll work in pattern across a set number of stitches for your size. So that means I'm going to slip my first one and knit one, slip my first one and knit one, slip my next one and knit, it's not my first one, just repeating myself. And I'm going to do this until I have the correct number of stitches for my size. And it's about 2/3 of the way across my stitches. When you get there, the next thing is that you're going to do an SSK. And I've shown a technique that I learned from Patty Lyon's book, The Knitting Bag of Tricks, for a neater, tidier looking SSK. I'm just going to demonstrate it super quick here. We, in the shop, we call this the kimono sleeve SSK because it reminds us of somebody who's wearing long, wide sleeves, tucking their hands into both sleeves. So in this SSK, slightly different. In normal SSK, you go knitwise into the first stitch on your left needle, knitwise into the second stitch on your left needle, and then you put your left needle into the fronts of those two stitches and work them together around the back. That's a normal SSK. I'm going to put these back on the way they were. With the kimono sleeve SSK, you slip the first one knitwise, and then you put the tip of your left needle into the front of that stitch and slide the tip of your right needle into the back of the stitch next to it. Wrap around and work them together. And then you can give them a little extra tug, but it creates a very nice left-leaning decrease. At this point, so I've worked my set number of stitches and then an SSK, the pattern tells you to turn, and you do not work back on all of the stitches, but you do slip the first stitch and then purl. Wrong side rows are always start with a slip stitch and then purl, and we're going to purl a set number of stitches, about 1/3 of the stitches that are there. Okay. And then, so I slipped the first stitch, I worked a set number of stitches, about 1/3 of the stitches over, and now I'm just going to purl two together. So the next two stitches are purled together. Nothing fancy. Give it a little snug and turn. That is a right-leaning decrease, and over here I have a left-leaning decrease. Now at this point, I should have the same number of stitches on each edge. 3, 6, 7, 8, 3, 6, 7, 8. So I do. So I know that I have centered this. I've done a decrease on each side of it, and it is centered because there's the same number of stitches on the left side of my needle and the right side of my needle. Okay, now we're going to do row 3 of the reinforced heel turn. And I just want you to pay attention because it tells you to start with a slip 1. So we slip that first stitch, but then it tells you to resume working in pattern. And if you notice, this first stitch is a slip stitch. So this pattern for row 3 is really slip 2, slip 1 purlwise, and then slip another one purlwise, and then knit 1. Slip 1, knit 1. Because we want to stay in this pattern of having our slip stitches in a line. And you're going to do that essentially, you don't have to count so hard, you do it until you get to the turning gap. So you want to knit, slip 1, knit 1 until you get to the last but one stitch of that center section. And it's the one that's on the near side of that turning gap. Now we're going to do an SSK again. So if you want to see that kimono sleeve one again, it's in knitwise. So I slip this stitch knitwise, and then I put the left tip into the front of the stitch and the right tip into the back of the next stitch. Wrap them together. It makes this beautiful little turn. And we're going to turn back and slip that first stitch and purl all of the stitches to the last but one. This is row 4, you're purling all of the stitches until you get to the turning gap again. So you don't have to get hung up on counting if you can see that gap clearly coming up on your needles. So there's my gap. And again, this is just a purl two together. And then you turn back. So what's interesting here is we're maintaining the same number of stitches in the middle. You're not knitting one more stitch, so you're not getting the parallelogram. You're getting a rectangle in the shape of the toe. So when you slip this first stitch, you're going to slip the second one because that's that same stitch. And then knit one, slip one. So you repeat all of these steps until you get to the end of the heel turn. So each time, you don't have to count if you don't want to. You stop when you get to the turn. I'm going to do my SSK, my special fun SSK. This step of turning the heel doesn't take very long. I do recommend, it's kind of like doing short rows. I do recommend that you do it all in one sitting if you can. It doesn't keep well if you put it down in the middle. So like if you're coming up to the heel turn and it's 11:30 at night, don't keep going. Just put it down and take a little rest and come back when you have, half an hour or however long that you can devote to doing the heel turn, because you don't want to stop in the middle of short rows. It's always confusing. I have a few more to do. Does anybody have any questions so far?
So I'm still back on the two setup rows. The stitches are still divided in half. You have half on one needle.
Half on the front needle, half on the back.
So it is still half, even with that +1.
So the +1 means that the next stitch you work is on the other needle.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to.
It's not on the same needle.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that.
But
Thanks.
she calls this a pattern that is needle fluid. So
okay.
I think what she was trying to do is not say, work all of the stitches on needle one or work all of the stitches on your front needle. She was trying to say work, to one stitch into your heel stitches, if that makes sense. So like if there were 10 stitches on the front needle and 10 stitches on the back needle, stitch 11 would be the equivalent. So you would knit stitch 11, which would be the first stitch on your back needle, and then you would have 9 remaining. And the way that her math works out, that works out. That's perfect. That's exactly what you're supposed to have. And then when you turn, you work back on all of the stitches, including the one that you knitted as part of the instep. So you still work on half of the stitches for your heel flap. There's not a new arrangement. Is that super clear?
Yeah, yes, that helps. Thanks.
So I emailed her and I asked why. And I also, like wanted to confirm that it's this stitch, not that stitch that we're talking about. And she confirmed it, but she did not tell me why. And I'm a little sad because I feel like there's a reason. And I guess the reason is that it sets up this slip stitch pattern, and you just don't want to slip it in the very first. You want to work it in the very first row of it. You don't want to slip it in the first row. So I think I answered it myself, but I wanted Kate to tell me. And whenever I meet her in person, it's going to be the first thing I asked her. Why? So I'm still doing my kimono sleeve. Got a couple more rows to do. I've seen one person who's all the way done with these socks. Or two people are all the way done. So they skipped ahead, but most people were stopped at the heel because this was sort of it was just a funny little road bump for everybody, including me. It took me a minute to figure it out. So you feel a little bit like you had a road bump. Now I keep wanting to knit that second stitch. I've stopped myself every single time. So do stop yourself every single time so that you keep your slip stitches in the stack. It is slip 2. All right. We're just about ready to pick up our gusset stitches. When you end this, you'll have a set number of stitches. It's 2 more than a third, I think, of your original stitches. Yeah, did it again. So the benefit of doing this slip stitch patterning on the heel is that is a place where a lot of people wear out their heels of their socks, is along this part right underneath the base of the heel. So this is my last time doing row 4. I still slip that first one and then purl across. No, that's a little blurry, but I don't think you need to see my purling in detail. Come to the last 2 stitches and purl them together. So the number in the middle that you work each time, and then one on either end, that was the decreased stitch on either end. All right. So there is that. It sort of like makes a little box. Looks like a little 3D box. One of our knitters says it's very comfortable to have this Dutch heel. All right. I'm beginning the top of page 4. I'm going to slip the first stitch and work the rest across. If you wanted to, you could place a stitch marker here. This is going to be the beginning of your round. She has you place it coming up, but you could place it in the middle of these stitches. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And now we're just knitting. We are done with the reinforced. So there's my new beginning of round marker. But I am working the gusset setup row number 1. When I finish those stitches, I'm not going to use my left needle for the pickup. I'm going to take, so the way that she writes this, she wants you to pick up a set number of stitches for your size along the edge of the heel flap using the slip stitch as a guide. Now, when I did this initially, I just picked up the underneath the whole stitch. So I don't know if you can see that. But I'm under both legs of the stitch there. And when we went back and read further and it said to go through the back loop, that doesn't make sense. And I think the issue is that if you go under both legs, it makes a very firm edge. It has more bulk inside of that heel than might be comfortable for some people. So I believe that what she wants you to do is to pick up just a single edge stitch and knit into it. And I'm going to do that, the single edge stitch for each one of those slip stitch edges. Is there anybody who thinks it's a different way? Because that's what I think. Oh, so little. Now, normally I would say, pick up at least one stitch in from the edge because I want a strong edge or strong seam. But in your sock, you want it to be as smooth as possible. So on the inside, what that looks like is almost like there's nothing there. It almost looks like just a purl ridge. So I'm going from what I think of as the front side towards the back side of the work and then wrapping around my needle. I'm going to do that right up to the top. And so I have half of my heel stitches here. I have the correct number of stitches to here. I'm going to reposition my left needle and work across my instep stitches for the first time in a minute. So I'm repositioning for magic loop and just working across those instep stitches. If you have not tracked which row of your ribbing you are on, you will want to pay attention when you come to the ribbing to determine whether or not you need to knit 2, purl 2, or just knit across. So let's take a look. Here's the beginning of my ribbing. And you can see that there is a knit stitch under the one on the needle. The purl stitch is 2 rows down. So I am ready for a purl stitch in my rib section. So I'm going to purl 2, knit 2 to the end of this little section. So I do recommend making sure that you are continuing your ribbing as it was set up. So there's no little gap of extra stockinette or extra purl stitches. And you're going to go right to the end. Now, we're going to keep these instep stitches separate from the rest of the sock. So we're going to turn. I'm going to push the cable in as far as I can. Even though I'm not going to work with the left needle, I just want to make sure that this is as big a cable as I can make it. And I'm going to pull out the right hand needle and pick up the edge stitches again. So I use my fingers to roll those edges toward me. And I go under the edge stitch and pick up one, go under the edge stitch and pick up another one. I'm going to pick up, hopefully, the same number that I did before. When you get to the end, you'll be joining back in the round. We won't talk about rows and wrong sides anymore. We'll be just doing in the round. One more, so I'm going to just squeeze it in there. Okay. So now I've pushed my left needle back into the stitches and finish my round. At this point in the pattern, she tells you to work to the middle of those heel stitches and place a marker to denote the beginning of the round. But as I said, you can place it the round before. Okay. Now, the next round is the gusset setup round 2. And the only thing that is different from just knitting all the way around is that as we come to those stitches that we picked up, we're going to work them through the back loop. So this is the first one. So working it through the back loop twists the stitches and takes up a little bit of the slack. It also is just a way of reinforcing. So when you knit through the front loop, you're doing that. When you knit through the back loop, I think of it as like running my needle down running my right needle down the left needle and going into the back leg. The result of that is that there's a little cross at the base of each stitch. It's a little bit textured and it creates a little bit more tension. It takes up any slack and it creates a little bit of extra reinforcement without a lot of bulk. So the point of this, I think, is to keep the bulk to a minimum and to make it nice and firm along this edge of stitches. So you do that along the entire gusset at the beginning and then on the other side of the instep. If you think about the fact that you did whichever row of the pattern for the instep the row before, it'll help you keep going. So when I get to the end of my gusset stitches, I'm going to reposition my needles. So I move this along. All of the stitches for the gusset are now on one side. So that's more than we started with. And then we turn and only the same original stitches are on the instep. I push my left needle into those stitches before I pull out my right needle when I do magic loop. I just like to make sure that I don't lose my loops on the ends. And these stitches, because I did my purl 2 knit 2 section before, this time I'm just going to knit across all the stitches. And the way that I can double check that as I come up to those ribbed sections is I look down, and I showed you before that it looked like there was a knit stitch right below the one on the needle. Now you can see that there's a purl stitch right below the one on the needle. So you don't have to count all your rows to tell. You can just look down and see whether or not you should be knitting these or purling these based on how it looks at the base of the stitch inside of that ribbing. All right. Now we pick up the gusset stitch, or we work the gusset stitches on the other side through the back loop. So I'm turning my work around again, repositioning my needles. So I don't fuss with them too much. I just get this one close to where it's going to be and this nice big loop on the right hand side. I turn holding my yarn out of the way, and then I push this in. And it's a little tricksy because it's got a curve to it and it wants to be a U shape, and it's harder to push the needle in when it wants to be a U shape, but you just make it go. This one comes out, and then the first set of stitches I'm going to be working through the back loop. And hopefully that will help take up some of the slack there. If it doesn't, and I feel like those holes are too big, I might go back and darn them closed when I'm finished with the sock. We talked a little bit about whether or not you would pick up exactly the number of stitches that she requires. And I would say that every person is different. Sometimes we go longer or shorter with the back of our heel than the pattern represents. And if that's the case, you may want to pick up fewer or more stitches along this gusset here. If you do, it's the end result of our decreases that determines your next step. So let me just get to the end of this. 2 more. So now I'm back to the beginning of the round, and this is the beginning of the gusset decrease round 1. And I just want to show you what we're looking at here. Ooh, so many things. Okay. So this is the bottom stitches that we started with and the extra gusset stitches that we picked up. So this is way more stitches than together than this instep is. The instep is still the original number. When we are done with the decreases on this part, I will have the same number of stitches on this needle or the bottom needle as we do on the top. So, for example, if you, using that diagram, if you have 10 stitches, because we don't, and we're supposed to have 20 stitches that we were picking up between these and the ones we picked up, but we don't, we have some other number. The thing to realize is that this decrease and this decrease have to be half of this one. So this would have to decrease down to 5, and this would have to decrease down to 5, so that this side has the same number of stitches as that side. So if you, I'm making these numbers up again because we're not sharing all of the details of the pattern. But if you pick up a different number of stitches than what the pattern designer tells you to pick up, and it is asymmetric, like there's one more over here or 2 fewer over here, the reality is you need to do the decreases for that side until you get to half of the number of stitches for the instep. And that should give you a little freedom to pick up stitches. Like I picked up exactly what I was told to, but ideally I maybe would have picked up 1 or 2 more up here where I have a little bit of a gap now. So this is an option that you have as you're making your own socks, because if you pick up some extra stitches along the way, you can get rid of them in the decrease section and get back to the same number, and it will fit better and it won't have gaps. It's just a way of sort of closing those gaps up. All right, so let me just demonstrate the decreases. So I've moved, I'm on this row. We're back to just knitting regularly. And you're going to work to 3 stitches before the instep. So this happens in the middle of the first half of the heel side. The decreasing always happens next to the instep stitches. So at the top of this section, so here's my beginning of round, I'm going to work to 3 stitches before my instep stitches. I'm on a decrease row. So I work to these 3 stitches, and then she has you do a knit 2 together. When you get there. And then a knit 1. So the decrease happens 3 stitches before the end. You knit them together, knit 2 stitches together, knit 1, and then you prepare to work your instep stitches. Now, those of you who have been paying attention know that I am on a purl row of the pattern. So I'm only saying that because it's easy to lose track of which round you are doing your decreases on. So pay attention. If this is a purl round for you, then that's also a decrease round. Make a little mental note so that you don't lose track. If it's not, if it's a knit round because you stopped in a different place when you made your socks, that's okay. But just pay attention to that, because that's an easy way to keep track of which round you're on, whether you're on a decrease round or not. And it's an easy place to look to see, oh, I'm on my decrease round this time. So I get over to my ribbing and it's a purl 2, knit 2 to the end. Okay, and then I turn again. And this is my decrease. This time it's going to be an SSK. So I do position my left needle in place before I move my right needle. I knit 1. And then I do my SSK. Again, monosleeve technique that I showed you. I'm being a little bit tighter here because I do have that gap. I'm hoping that helps take it up a little bit. And then you're going to knit to the end of the round. The next round will be a plain round of knitting. And it will also match my plain round of knitting on the instep. So I continue until the number of stitches on this side equals the number of stitches on this side in 2 halves, half here and half after the marker. At that point, I'll work straight on all of the stitches, continuing with the ribbing pattern only until I get to the length of my foot before the toe. So I just want to talk about that very briefly and then we're done. I'm just going to knit 1 stitch so I don't lose it. But that's the heel turn. Isn't it pretty? Look at that heel turn. It's so sturdy. And then those are our gussets, and our gussets are pretty smooth. It's pretty smooth in there. It doesn't feel real lumpy. So I like her technique. And then that twisted stitch is not particularly noticeable, but it does give a little extra tension and a little extra texture. Okay, Your Foot. Your Foot by Beth Billings. Here is your foot. Woo, that is an ugly foot. Here is the back of your foot. Here's the front of your foot. This measurement is your whole foot length. We've talked about measuring your feet before. You should measure your whole foot length with your heel against something vertical and your foot again on top of preferably a rigid ruler, and your weight on the foot. You should have weight on the foot measuring it. Whatever this measurement is, let's say it's 10 inches, you're going to continue from, this is the turn of your heel, you're going to measure until you get to this much less than your 10 inches. So if, for example, picking a number out of the air, this were 3 inches, you would work this part to 7 inches. If this were 1/16 of an inch, you would work this until you were 8 and 15/16. Is that right? Yeah, 8 and 15/16. Whatever this number is, it's your whole foot length minus that you work from the heel turn before you stop, before we do our toes. So you should have a measurement of your foot to base that on. If you don't have a measurement of your foot, there are charts available for what length your foot is based on your shoe size. They're less reliable. Better to measure your actual foot. And that's from heel to toe with weight on your foot. And another way to do it, if you can get a helper to help you, another way is to draw it, keeping the pen completely perpendicular as you go around with weight on your foot. That's why it's better to have a helper. And it's better if you do that on a piece of cardboard than a piece of paper. All right. How much fun was that? I love turning a heel. It's my favorite thing. Do any of you have any questions?
I just have a question on the foot length.
Mm-hmm.
Do we do negative ease on that measurement at all, or do we just really take that actual foot length?
I believe. Good question.
Or did she mention, and I don't remember?
She mentions it. She says desired finished foot length. So that
Got it.
does take your negative ease into consideration. So if your foot length is 11,
Mhm.
then your desired negative ease would be 10, roughly. So whatever your foot length is, minus 10%.
Got it. Mm.
Does she talk about that in here?
You know, that's what I was trying to remember if that was mentioned, that she, in her toe, you know, how she works the toe decreases, if that takes into consideration that negative ease. So
Desired finished foot length. My recommendation, if there's any question on how long your foot should be, all she says in the beginning of the pattern is that it's adjustable to preference. So there's no grafting. Pulling back the toe and re-knitting it is not going to be difficult.
Yeah.
Unless you don't have a lifeline in.
Oh, good point. Yes.
So
Okay.
why don't you get to where you think you should do the toe of your
Mhm.
first sock and put in a lifeline? Do the toe and try it on. You'll know exactly what you need. You might have to re-knit the toe, but you'll have a lifeline in place.
I love it. Thank you.
It is really hard to measure your feet.
Yes, it is.
And I have never measured my feet and gotten the same measurement.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll give it a try. And also, I love that kimono decrease.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. Yeah.
Well, I credit Patty Lyons. It's in her book, The Bag of Knitting Tricks. I think it's brilliant. Kimono sleeve is just what we call it, but it's just such a wonderful, it lays so nicely and so similarly to a knit two together, or a purl two together for that matter, which,
Great. Thank you.
the best decrease ever. You're very welcome. Any other questions? We did it. We did it in under an hour. I'm so proud. So your homework is to get to the end of your foot. If you can get to the end of the foot on both socks, that's gravy. If you can get to the end of the foot on one sock, that's also good. We are not meeting in May because May has Memorial Day in it. I believe we are meeting, I will tell you the date of the next one. It is June 3rd, my brother's birthday. He will be 59. So old. I remember when he was 6. So June 3rd, we'll be doing the toe. I'm really excited about this toe. I haven't done it yet, but it doesn't look too hard and there's no grafting involved, which is just a joy. Have a wonderful month of May.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.